Investigators were back at the Nancy Guthrie home today with the most visible activity we've seen in days.
Investigators were back at the Nancy Guthrie home today, and what they uncovered is unlike anything you've ever seen. The FBI interrogation of her son-in-law didn't just raise questions, it proved everything. Stay with me, because the next moments you're about to hear will chill you to the bone. It started with a traced phone call at 2:47 a.m., capturing his voice coordinating the kidnapping. Weeks of text messages mapped out every single detail of the plan. Even his laptop, wiped 3 days before his arrest, still held searches on how long an elderly woman can survive without her heart medication. For the first 90 minutes, he sat there in pajamas, performing the worried family member so convincingly you'd almost believe him. Almost. Then the lead agent played the recording, and what happened next is impossible to forget. His face drained of color, his hands shaking uncontrollably, 6 hours of psychological collapse that no one could have predicted. Every lie, every pivot, every failed excuse was exposed. And here's the kicker. This footage wasn't supposed to exist. It was never meant to go public. Now, you're about to witness the unraveling of a man who thought he was untouchable, and what the FBI uncovered will leave you speechless. Early that morning, the quiet neighborhood around Nancy Guthrie's home didn't look like the center of a federal investigation. From the outside, it appeared calm. A few parked vehicles, a couple of agents moving slowly around the property, and yellow tape that had already been there for days. But inside the investigation, things were moving fast. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. To her neighbors, she was the friendly woman who waved from her porch and never missed a chance to talk about her grandchildren. She carried their photos everywhere, tucked neatly inside her purse. Every evening followed a simple routine. Dinner at home, a few phone calls with family, sometimes a card game when relatives visited. It was the kind of life built on trust and familiarity. The last normal evening began exactly like that. Nancy had gone to dinner with family. It was a quiet gathering, nothing unusual. They talked, shared stories, and at one point Nancy laughed while remembering something about her late husband. The kind of laugh that fills a room and makes everyone else smile too. By the end of the night, everything looked perfectly ordinary. Her son-in-law offered to drive her home. According to his story, he dropped her off around 9:45 p.m. He said he walked her to the front door, waited until he heard the lock click, and then left. When investigators first heard that version, it sounded clean, simple, and believable. The kind of story someone tells when nothing is wrong. But detectives quickly noticed something else. The story never changed. When investigators asked him again the next day, the timeline was identical. The same words, the same details. What Nancy wore, what she ate, even the joke she told during dessert. Everything repeated with perfect consistency. At first glance, that might seem like a good sign, but experienced investigators know something important. Real memories are messy. People forget small details. They mix things up. They hesitate. Rehearsed stories don't. That was the first small signal that something wasn't right. Meanwhile, agents began examining the physical evidence around Nancy's house. They checked the doors, the windows, the security cameras, and the surrounding neighborhood. Nothing looked forced. No broken locks, no shattered glass. Whoever took Nancy knew exactly how to enter and exactly where to go, which meant one thing: this wasn't random. Someone had studied the house. Someone knew Nancy's routine. Someone knew when she would be most vulnerable. And that realization narrowed the list of possibilities very quickly. Investigators started reviewing phone records connected to people close to Nancy, family members, friends, anyone who had spoken with her recently. Among hundreds of normal calls and messages, one detail stood out. A short phone call placed at 2:47 a.m. The number came from a burner phone, the kind designed to disappear after use. But the call didn't go to a stranger. It went directly to Nancy's son-in-law. At first, he explained it away as a mistake, a wrong number, something insignificant. But when agents asked for more information, the explanation started shifting. First it was confusion, then uncertainty, then the claim that he simply couldn't remember. That's when the investigation started digging deeper. Agents pulled weeks of text message records between the son-in-law and a man named Marcus, a cousin who had recently been struggling financially. The messages stretched back nearly 3 weeks before Nancy disappeared. At first, they looked harmless. Then the details started appearing. Conversations about schedules, discussions about cameras, mentions of doors, alarms, and routines. Messages that referenced Nancy's nightly habits with an accuracy that felt impossible for an outsider to know. Each message by itself looked small. but together, they formed something much larger. A map. A step-by-step breakdown of Nancy's life and the vulnerabilities inside it. Still, the son-in-law maintained his composure during early questioning. He spoke calmly, confidently, even offered to help investigators however he could. Anyone watching from the outside might have believed he was just another worried family member trying to find answers. And for nearly 90 minutes during his official FBI interrogation, that performance held together perfectly. He sat across from two agents in a quiet interview room, relaxed, answering questions without hesitation. His hands rested calmly on the table. His voice stayed steady. He even asked investigators how the search for Nancy was going, as if he were just as desperate for updates as everyone else. But the agents across from him weren't asking questions to learn the story. They already knew the story. What they were doing was something much more strategic. They were letting him lock himself into it. Every answer he gave, every timeline he repeated, every detail he insisted was true. All of it was quietly being recorded and documented. Because somewhere in that building, investigators had already uncovered something that would shatter his story completely. And they were waiting for the exact right moment to reveal it. While the son-in-law continued explaining his version of events, investigators were quietly building a timeline that told a very different story. Every minute he spent repeating his carefully constructed narrative was another minute agents used to compare his words with the evidence already sitting on the table. For the first hour and a half, he seemed comfortable. He leaned back in the chair, speaking clearly, sometimes even asking questions of his own. Anyone watching the footage without context might think he was simply a worried relative trying to help solve a disappearance. But the agents across from him had already reviewed the phone records. They had already read the text messages. And they had already listened to the recording that would eventually change everything. When the questioning shifted slightly toward the early morning hours after Nancy disappeared, the tone in the room changed. The lead agent asked a simple question. Had anyone contacted him during the night? The son-in-law paused for a moment, then shook his head. No, he said he slept through the night and woke up to the same confusion everyone else felt when Nancy couldn't be reached the next morning. It sounded simple, direct, confident. But the agents knew about the call. At 2:47 a.m., a burner phone connected briefly to his personal cell phone. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. On paper, it looked insignificant. But when investigators traced the phone's movements, it placed the caller within a few miles of Nancy's home at the exact time she disappeared. When the agent asked again whether he remembered any calls, the son-in-law hesitated slightly before repeating his answer. No, that hesitation was small, but it mattered, because it meant the story was beginning to crack. Investigators then moved to another subject, his communication with Marcus. At first, he described Marcus as a cousin going through a difficult time, someone he occasionally helped financially, someone he hadn't spoken with much recently. But the text messages told a different story. Over 3 weeks, the two men had exchanged dozens of messages. Many of them looked ordinary. Discussions about work, money problems, family matters. But mixed between those normal conversations were messages that caught investigators' attention. References to Nancy's schedule, mentions of the layout of her house, questions about security cameras and alarms. The son-in-law initially dismissed them as jokes or misunderstandings. He suggested Marcus might have been asking out of curiosity or casual conversation. But agents had something more than just texts. They had location data from cell towers. Every message had been sent from places that matched the son-in-law's daily routine. His workplace, his home, restaurants where his credit card records confirmed he had been sitting at the exact moment the texts were sent. There was no anonymous hacker, no unknown third party. Every digital trail pointed back to the same person. Even so, he continued trying to maintain control of the conversation. His voice remained calm, but his posture began to change. The relaxed confidence from earlier was fading. He leaned forward more often now. His hands moved slightly on the table, small signs of tension that investigators notice immediately. Then the agents introduced another piece of evidence: financial records. Over the previous 3 weeks, the son-in-law had withdrawn nearly $30,000 in cash. Not small ATM withdrawals spread over months. Large amounts taken out quickly, sometimes on consecutive days. When asked where the money went, his answers became less certain. First, he mentioned business expenses. Then he suggested home repairs. Moments later, he admitted he might have loaned some money to Marcus, but couldn't remember exactly how much. Each explanation contradicted the one before it, and every contradiction was quietly noted. At this point, the confident performance from the beginning of the interrogation was starting to fade. His breathing was slightly faster. His responses took longer. For nearly 2 hours, he had managed to stay one step ahead of the questions, offering explanations that seemed just plausible enough to survive the moment. But investigators weren't looking for quick answers anymore. They were building pressure. The room itself remained calm. The agents spoke in steady voices. No raised tones. No accusations. Just questions, followed by long stretches of silence that forced the son-in-law to fill the space with more words. And the more he spoke, the more problems appeared in his story. Still, he believed he could talk his way out of it. What he didn't realize was that the most damaging piece of evidence hadn't been mentioned yet. Sitting only a few feet away from him was a laptop containing an audio file investigators had already listened to several times. A recording captured during that mysterious 2:47 a.m. phone call. For nearly 90 minutes, the agents had allowed him to repeat his version of events, letting him grow comfortable with the belief that the investigation had little more than suspicions. But that comfort was about to disappear, because in a few moments, they were going to press play, and the voice that filled the room next would be his own. For nearly 2 hours, the son-in-law had managed to keep his story intact. Not perfectly, but well enough to believe he might still talk his way through the interrogation. The room stayed quiet, the agents calm and patient, letting him explain and re-explain the same timeline over and over again. But the moment eventually came when the lead agent stopped asking questions. Instead, he leaned slightly forward and slid a laptop across the table. The son-in-law looked at it with mild curiosity. At that point, he still believed the investigators were searching for answers rather than presenting them. The agent spoke slowly. He said there was something they wanted him to hear. At first, the son-in-law didn't react. His posture stayed relaxed, his hands resting on the table like they had for most of the interview. Whatever confidence he had built over the last 2 hours was still there. Then the audio began to play. The voice that filled the small interrogation room was unmistakable. It was his. The recording came from that short phone call placed at 2:47 a.m. A burner phone contacting his personal number in the middle of the night. On the call, the second voice sounded tense, almost panicked, explaining that the situation had become complicated. The plan wasn't going the way it was supposed to. Nancy was weaker than expected. The ransom demand hadn't worked. The caller asked what they should do next, and the man responding on the recording wasn't surprised. He wasn't confused. He was giving instructions. He talked about timing, about keeping the situation quiet, about what would happen if things got worse. The kind of details that only someone deeply involved would understand. The moment the son-in-law realized what he was hearing, everything changed. His expression froze. The calm confidence that had carried him through the interrogation for nearly 2 hours disappeared in seconds. The color drained from his face as he listened to his own voice speaking through the laptop speakers. When the recording ended, the room fell completely silent. The agent let that silence stretch for several seconds before asking a single question. Was that his voice? The son-in-law answered quickly. No, he claimed the recording must have been manipulated or misunderstood. He said it sounded similar, but it wasn't him. Someone must have been trying to frame him. But the denial didn't carry the same confidence his earlier answers had. His voice cracked slightly. His hands, which had remained steady for most of the interview, began to tremble on the edge of the table. The agent pressed play again. This time the recording paused at specific moments, isolating certain sentences. Each pause highlighted details that connected directly to the text messages investigators had already discussed. References to Nancy's nightly routine, mentions of the house layout, comments about the timing of her medication. With every replay of the recording, the son-in-law's attempts to explain it grew weaker. He shifted in his chair, leaning back as if trying to create distance from the sound of his own voice filling the room. Then the agent introduced the next piece of evidence. Printed text messages. The folder dropped onto the table was thick, filled with page after page of conversations between him and Marcus. Messages that described exactly how Nancy's home could be entered, where the security cameras were located, and when she would likely be alone. The agent began reading them out loud. One message talked about disabling the doorbell camera first. Another explained which door had the weakest lock. Another referenced the time Nancy usually took her evening medication and went to bed. Each message was slid across the table as it was read, giving the son-in-law a clear view of his own words printed in black ink. By now, his earlier confidence was completely gone. His shoulders slumped. His breathing became shallow. He tried to explain the texts away, claiming they were jokes or misinterpretations. At one point, he suggested someone else might have used his phone without permission. But investigators already had the technical data proving the messages were sent from his device at times and locations matching his daily movements. Every explanation collapsed under the evidence. Then the agents revealed something that shifted the investigation from suspicion to motive. Financial records. The son-in-law had been in serious trouble. His bank accounts were overdrawn. Credit cards were maxed out. Mortgage payments had fallen behind. Total debts had climbed past $200,000. At the same time, investigators discovered something else. Nancy Guthrie's will. The document stated that her estate, worth several $million, would be divided between her two daughters. If Nancy died before changing that document, the son-in-law's wife would inherit a large portion of that money that would legally become shared marital property. But there was one critical detail. Nancy had already scheduled an appointment with her attorney to change the will. The new version would reduce the amount her daughter received, cutting off the financial lifeline the son-in-law was depending on. That appointment was only days away. As the agents explained this, the reality of the situation became impossible to ignore. The son-in-law wasn't just facing evidence connecting him to the kidnapping. He was facing proof of a motive, a desperate financial situation, a large inheritance about to disappear, and a plan that investigators were now reconstructing piece by piece. By the fourth hour of questioning, the man who had walked into the room believing he could control the conversation was barely speaking at all. But investigators still had one final development waiting, because somewhere else in the building, Marcus had already started talking, and what he was telling agents was about to destroy the last remaining version of the son-in-law story. 6 hours earlier, Nancy Guthrie's son-in-law walked into that FBI interview room believing he could out-talk the evidence and walk right back out the same door. But by the end of that interrogation, every lie had collapsed. The 2:47 a.m. phone call, the text messages outlining Nancy's routine, the cash withdrawals, the searches on his laptop. Piece by piece, the evidence built a picture that was impossible to deny. What makes this interrogation even more disturbing is what never happened during those 6 hours. Despite all the questions, all the recordings, and all the pressure, he never once showed real concern about Nancy herself. An 84-year-old woman who carried photos of her grandchildren everywhere she went had disappeared, yet the man sitting across from federal agents never truly asked if she was safe. That detail stayed with investigators long after the interview ended, because what Marcus later revealed about the first 48 hours after Nancy was taken shocked even experienced agents. The information he gave investigators pointed to locations, decisions, and moments that changed the entire direction of the case. And the most terrifying question still remained unanswered. Where was Nancy Guthrie, and was she still alive? If you want to see what investigators uncovered next, make sure you're subscribed and stay tuned, because the next part of this case reveals the discovery that changed everything.